Hello, I'm Jeff Dodds, Chair of the Board of Directors of the Chartered Professional Accountants of British Columbia, CPABC. Welcome to the session, Indigenomics and Reconciliation. CPABC carries out its primary mission to protect the public by enforcing the highest professional and ethical standards and contributing to the advancement of public policy and to BC's economic and social development. As part of these efforts, CPABC is embarking on its own Indigenous strategy. CPABC is committed to enhancing Indigenous financial management capacity through initiatives such as our Memorandum of Understanding with the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association of BC, which outlines how we will work together to enhance financial management and governance with Indigenous communities in BC. We are delighted to sponsor this session and hope you will connect with us at our virtual exhibitor booth.
Tanchi, hello. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Hurley. I am the chair of the Vancouver Island Economic Alliance, principal of the Hurley Martin Group, and a proud citizen of the Métis Nation of British Columbia. I want to acknowledge with gratitude that VIEA operates on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish, Nuu-chah-nulth, and Kwakiutl peoples. And I'm speaking to you today from Gabriola Island on the traditional unceded territories of the Snuneymuxw peoples. This panel session on Indigenomics and Reconciliation is very timely and important, not only for Vancouver Island, but for all Canadians. Indigenous peoples are increasingly taking control of their economic future by harnessing the full potential of their lands and their peoples. Everyone wins when Indigenous peoples and communities thrive as full partners in economic prosperity. Indigenomics is the foundation for economic reconciliation, and it is only possible when Canada's economic outcomes embrace social justice. What can we do together to make this vision reality? As Island First Nations continue developing their economies, how will all of our local economies relate for mutual benefit? Here to address these questions today are two distinguished speakers. Carol-Ann Hilton is founder and CEO of the Indigenomics Institute, an Indigenous economic advisory for public governments, Indigenous communities, and the private sector. She's joining us from Victoria. And Karen Joseph is CEO of Reconciliation Canada, an Indigenous charity focused on engaging Canadians in dialogue and transformative experiences that revitalize the relationship among Indigenous peoples and with all Canadians. And she's joining us from West Vancouver. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Dan.
To begin our session, I'll ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and make some opening remarks. Carol-Ann, we will start with you first.
Sure, thank you. Uklasish Carol-Ann Hilton, Heshkwiak Supsishu Klas Wakatushko Atsa Umti. My English name is Carol-Ann Hilton. I am Nuu-chah-nulth from the Heshkwiak Nation near Hot Springs Cove. My Nuu-chah-nulth name is Wakatush, which means big sister. As the CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute, I am inspired by a history in Canada, in BC, and on Vancouver Island of systemic Indigenous economic exclusion. And it's in being inspired of understanding our role as Indigenous peoples, of how we have come from and are informed by thousands of years old Indigenous economies. And it's in building visible business success today that this is really important to begin to pay attention to the growing size and strength of Indigenous business and the role in leadership in reconciliation, in aligning our relationships to forming positive actions and shaping an economic narrative that supports this new emerging concept that we are powerful economic powerhouses. How this is reflected on the island, I think that within the State of the Island Forum, what we're beginning to see and begin to understand is this demonstration of the ability to look at where Indigenous businesses are growing and what we're seeing, and begin to practice seeing with mindfulness of the strength of the Indigenous economy, economic presence, and bringing visibility to that going forward. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Karen, we will now hear from you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Caroline. That was a lovely introduction to a very complicated and important conversation that we're having here today. I'm honored to serve with as the CEO of Reconciliation Canada. I too originate from Vancouver Island. I'm Kwakwaka'wakw from the northern tip of Vancouver Island on the east coast, as opposed to where Caroline is. I'm a daughter of a hereditary chief and matriarch. My Indigenous name is Kunwakagilich, which means thunderbird in the house. I'm a part of the Musqueam people, which is a really interesting group of people that really embraces or embodies my understanding of the word Namwiyut. We're all one. We're very, very isolated. And as a result of that, we need to rely on one another in order to create a sustainable economy that benefits all of us. And I think, that really informs much of the conversation today that I'm hoping to have with everybody. My understanding of economic reconciliation is very similar in one state to what Caroline is talking about in terms of the amount of resources that are currently going untapped within our communities. It's not well known across this country that actually the number one contributor to rural wealth in Canada actually occurs from First Nations. And that's certainly true as we go further north on Vancouver Island. I think some of the things that really intrigue me about the conversations that we've had are, how are we defining economies? We currently exist in a very much a resource-based or extractive economy that typically removes those resources from traditional Indigenous or First Nations territories for the benefit of those outside of those communities. And as a country, the largest paying opportunities or jobs are located in southern cities, whereas that economic benefit typically comes from the northern regions. The other piece that really informs our economy in terms of what is valued, products and knowledge. And right now, because of our histories as people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, those types of values are defined predominantly in a non-Indigenous manner, where leadership is hierarchical, where the economy is linear, where you're able to access resources depending on your networks. We all have heard that comment, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And success is defined predominantly by, those with the most toys in the end wins. And there's this idea that there's a limitless opportunity when in fact we are so intrinsically connected to the lands that we are, that we need to think about some traditional practices and wisdoms around Namwiyut, we are all one, reciprocity, if we're going to be taking something, we need to be giving something back. We need to be thinking about values-based economies that honor Indigenous worldview. We need to be thinking about equity and resilience and sustainability. There's all kinds of buzzwords that we can throw around in here, but ultimately, the decisions that we make here on the island can either be very, very creative and create a long-term sustainable plan for our peoples, or we can run into some of the problems that we're having right now all across this country. I think we're in a very unique time. We have an amazing opportunity to think about where do we want to go from here and how do we want to show up, not only as a people, but in terms of the kind of economies that we want to create that are going to allow us to be able to live together in a unified way from now until time immemorial. Gail Kesla.
Gail Kesla, thank you so much. So at this time, I'd like to get Caroline and Karen into a conversation and to dive into some of these topics. But for those of you watching, we're going to have obviously some time at the end of our session to take some of your questions. So if you have a question throughout the session, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to write that in there. I'll be looking at those questions and we'll be trying to take as many of those as we can near the end of the session. Caroline, I'd like to start with you. Just to really dive into what the concept of Indigenomics means. So there's people watching us tonight who are business people, or this morning rather, that are business people, that are people who understand a certain concept of economics. And Indigenomics melds two very different concepts together. So I'd be interested for you to explain for us just what does that mean and how does that apply to our economic thinking?
For sure, thank you. So there's a number of aspects that I want to cover, and I like to say, if you haven't heard of Indigenomics, you're in the right place. And if you have, then you're right on time. So being able to demonstrate this concept of Indigenomics as modern Indigenous economic design. So the absence of modern Indigenous economic design is the perpetuation of continued poverty and the lack of support of well-being in our communities. What I see is that there is too much emphasis on this consistent measuring of the socioeconomic gap and an easiness to being able to perceive Indigenous peoples within negative statistics. So that could be ill health, it could be education levels, it could be poverty levels, any number of things. But often those are constructs that are not constructive, generative, or focused on economic design. So this concept of Indigenomics as modern Indigenous economic design supports a constructive business relationship. So even within this current COVID environment, what we're hearing from nations is we're generative economies, we're functioning, we have needs within these economies, but beginning to describe and building the understanding of new metrics around growing Indigenous business strength. I really push this concept of our leadership here is, what do we actually know about the Indigenous economy? In asking questions specifically here on the island, you can ask, how many First Nations economic development corporations are there? How many Indigenous businesses do we have here? How many of those are Indigenous entrepreneurs? What is the capital deployed to Indigenous businesses here on the island? What's the size of the labor force? So beginning to explore some of these questions, that instead of measuring the lack of or the deficit of, beginning to measure actual economic strength through these new perspectives. Without proper information, all we can look at is a demonstration of where we're seeing high levels of Indigenous economic activity. So this concept of Indigenomics as a platform for constructive generative economic design leaves the opportunity for leadership, and it leaves the opportunity for positive action to pay attention to the growth of Indigenous business. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much. So Karen, in hearing that, it really is it is a complete change of thinking in how we approach these challenges, and more importantly, how we approach opportunities. So when you bring this to the conversation around reconciliation and economic reconciliation, what do you think? Where do you see those opportunities for further dialogue for our overall population?
Well, I think there's so many different places that you can dive into this conversation, and there's so many different ways that we can look at economic reconciliation. So in terms of the current structure that exists, even with a redesign of it, the essential end goal is a piece of the economic pie. And how do we establish some level of shared prosperity based on that? We've done a lot of work within Reconciliation Canada, and particularly on the island. And one of the sort of fundamental bases that we started with was that you can actually change an economy, lift a community out of poverty, depending on the number of its workers that are in sort of management type positions. So we actually did some work with one of the communities on Vancouver Island. And what we did was sort of looked at all of the opportunities, all of the learning opportunities that were available to have a potential entrepreneur move into either a small business ownership or be able to contribute to some existing business that already was operating successfully within a community. And what we found was quite remarkable, was that a lot of the policies, or whether you want to call them policies or practices, that these communities that were existing side by side were utilizing actually undermined their ability to work together. So you would have a First Nations that would develop their own economic development plan, and you would have a municipality that concurrently would develop their economic plan, and the two never would meet in between. And yet, you know, their lands overlap, their ideas overlap, the kind of the direction or the natural steps of achieving those kind of goals would look very, very different. And so we started working together with those municipalities and the First Nations to determine how can we do something that's collective, that's creative, that allows us to overcome some of those self-inflicted barriers, quite frankly, and allow people to access training, for instance. Oftentimes, you'll get a lot of training opportunities that are available within the First Nations communities that the municipalities don't actually have resources to access. Conversely, within the municipalities, you have access to a lot of financial resources that Indigenous communities cannot access. So one part has one piece of the pie and the other part has the other piece of the pie, but there's no opportunity for them to work together. So those are some really easy ways of working within the community. I think one of the other things that was very practical that we learned from in there was one of the biggest hindrances, which is funny about who's actually sponsoring this particular talk, is the lack of accountants that are available within the rural communities that people trust and understand to help them manage their businesses as they're going through. We have lots of great entrepreneurs, and I don't fundamentally believe that you need to be a great accountant. You have to have some level of financial acumen, but you don't have to be an accountant to be a successful business person, but you do need that as a resource that you can access. That was the biggest deterrent for people within these communities. The other piece of it really was just linking together all of the learning opportunities that exist either through banks or through educational institutions or through mentorship, putting them in a clear trajectory that would allow a person to start from the beginning all the way to the end to establishing their business. And again, that was a relatively simple thing for us to do. But one of the things that I found, and then finally, was once you had this great business plan and everybody thought that it was a wonderful thing to do, typically what the final limiting factor was the $5,000 or $10,000 that it would require them to actually set up that business. And so you have lots of loans and grants and other kinds of things that are accessible to people once the business is established, but sometimes it's very, very little amounts of financial resources that are required in order to actually get them going. So we supplied that as well. The one thing that we note, well, there was a number of things that we noticed that struck me, and I was completely unprepared for it, was that of all the people that started the program, and we did this 2 or 3 different times, it was always Indigenous women in the end that stuck it through to building a business. And it had to do with the fact that they have all of these amazing transferable skills that go unnoticed and unrecognized in mainstream society. So typically, these were women that are leaders within our traditional cultures, and they're the ones that are in the back room pulling together our potlatches, pulling together our funerals, our ceremonies, our things. So they know who works well together, what skills that they need, what land bases or food or other kinds of things can they access through these people. They have a really intricate understanding of that local community and how they can link all of those resources together. And they can put these plans together within a day, including all of the people. And yet they're working in subsistent living jobs, or they're not working at all because there aren't jobs that are available to them. And this is probably one of the greatest untapped resources of a lot of our rural communities. And so that's something that I really would like to take a little bit of time exploring, because they're also the voice. If you talk about Indigenous people being wholly excluded from the economic conversation, and you layer that down into Indigenous women in either leadership positions or into this economic narrative, it's even more so. And the funny thing is, and it's relevant here today, it's present here today, the people that are actually really, really digging deep into this conversation are almost all Indigenous women. And yet, for the most part, we don't have those networks and that access into the privileged spaces that allow us to really move these conversations and these dialogues and, frankly, the practices forward in a meaningful way.
Well, thank you. That's so much. There's so much there. There's a lot of questions I'd like to ask there. But Caroline, I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond to a little bit of what Karen said, because it's really what you're talking about in practice in so many different aspects. So any thoughts in terms of Karen's comments there?
Yeah, for sure. I think that this concept of systemic exclusion is the cause of why we look through the lens of deficit or the Indian problem. So as we are able to address the perceptions of the Indigenous economy and Indigenous peoples, that's where we'll start to see success from. So if we look in this current context, we have the application of United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples into law here in BC. I think what is formative in my thinking of the essential components of the UNDRIP into law is the expression of Indigenous self-determination, the right to continue as people, and the right to an economy. So I position this concept that Indigenous peoples are the only ones who have ever had to fight for the right to an economy. So looking at how that has expressed itself, particularly I draw from my Nuu-chah-nulth experience, where the historical establishment of the reserve systems removed our people from access to the ocean. So we said the ocean was our garden or the foundation of our economy. So with the removal of that access through the reserve systems, through the fishing regulatory environment or forestry and regulatory environment, or different acts that prevented us from a way of life and an economy, what I want to quickly point out is that when, well over 10 years ago, when the Nuu-chah-nulth people took Canada to court, it pushed this new reality of having a seat at the economic table. So we had to fight for a right to an economy and express that within legal terms and our modernity as Indigenous people. So we come out of that case with the right to fish, which essentially I describe as everybody at the economic table needed to move over and make space for. 10 years later, we're still in that action of making room for or creating space at the economic table, of whether that's in the fishing industry, whether that's the tourism industry, whether that's the forest industry. If you follow the court cases, the demonstration of economic presence of Indigenous peoples has had to be expressed through a push and pull relationship. So Indigenous peoples have had to push this new economic reality where we're able to express economic modern rights. So what we see that as now is the duty to consult, accommodation, court cases such as in Nanaimo, the White case, all demonstrate the continuation of way of living or is demonstrated within economic presence. So I think this leadership place of where we're at today is really what I want to be able to stress, that the intention of a panel of this nature to present in 2020, right now, describing the state of the island economy. If we're not paying attention to the growth of Indigenous businesses, what becomes important in that is we lose the strategic ground of building partnerships, creating opportunity, establishing economic partnerships. Lastly, I draw your attention to this current NDP government established a revenue sharing agreement with the BC First Nations. So when we look at what that was expressed as within here in the Vancouver Island Indigenous economies, we saw little tiny small communities, 200 members maybe, super remote, had no access to actual the facilitation of economic opportunities. We may have seen the downfall of the fishing or forest industries historically. All of a sudden had a little bit of money to be able to leverage. And I think that that is beginning to demonstrate the leadership that's required to understand the fundamental design of the growth of the Indigenous economies. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'd like to build on what both of you have talked about in terms of, a lot of what you just described here has come from resilience. It has come from people, women and men, but you talked a lot about women as leaders having more resilience and success and being able to move these things forward and bring people to the table. But I wonder where the leadership opportunities are for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and businesses to be able to now say, rather than having it be a struggle or a court case or, where you're being forced to the table, where do you see the opportunity where people can now say, you know what, I'm going to come to the table with this opportunity? Where can I now, where I can see this work being done, this new way of looking at economic development in a more inclusive way? Where are the opportunities for leaders to come forward and now say, how can we help to build on this and to collectively grow together? Karen, do you want to start with that?
Thank you. Yes. When we're talking about where are there places for us to come together, I think you've really hit the opportunity. You've really clarified what the opportunity here for us, especially on Vancouver Island, because our communities are so closely related that you don't see this in sort of the interior of Canada. Their areas are so vast that they don't necessarily have to come into contact with one another. But on Vancouver Island, we do. And we do so often, and so many times we're intermarried, and there's a blurring of who's actually Indigenous or not Indigenous or on or off, and there's so many ways that we're connected. I think some of the opportunities that we have exist within having dialogue about what is our shared economic vision for a region. And that, to me, there's always some beautiful places, because Islanders, they understand the ecosystems that we live in, and the fact that, if we overfish all of our populations, we're not going to have any kind of sustainability leading on. If we strip our territories of all of the forest, then we're not going to be able to have any long-term self-sufficiency there. If we're continuously competing with one another on these across the street businesses, we're also undermining our ability to work together. There are a limited number of people who are coming into our territories that we need to find ways to work together. We need to say, oh, look, I'm full today, but there's this great business that's just down the road starting up that can do this as well. Whereas saying, oh, I'm full today, why don't you go to a different community, right? So those are some really easy places that we can do. But I also think that we have to start thinking about honoring Indigenous worldview. What does Namuyu mean? It means we're all one. When people think about those things, if you're non-Indigenous, you think about, oh yeah, we're all human, so we're all related. Well, from an Indigenous perspective, that means we're also related to the land, to the beings, to the animals, to all of those things. And reciprocity comes into that. So what I do to the land impacts me and generations to come. So what is my responsibility then in how I act in that? And I think that's the greatest opportunity for us from an economic model as we're going forward. And if we're thinking about sustainability, what does shared leadership look like? That's a huge conversation to be having. Because if we look at leadership rather than a wielding of power, it's a wielding of responsibility. We flip that narrative completely. And what does shared prosperity mean, actually? For us in Indigenous communities, when we're doing this, if you look at, for instance, a chief's role in how we define wealth as Indigenous peoples, wealth is defined by how well you're able to provide for everybody. Whereas wealth within a non-Indigenous context typically is defined as how much you're able to accumulate just for yourself and your immediate family. So how do we meld those two really different worldviews together to engage in a conversation around shared prosperity? The other piece of it is how are we teaching people to get into these kinds of things? You know, the big issue that people don't realize is that the Indian Act and all of these horrific policies that Canada has engaged in since the creation of this country have all been to get Indigenous people involved in the current economic structure. We're still there, not there how many hundreds of years later. So why don't we look at building a different kind of an economic structure that actually respects both of their values and both of their principles and allows people to continue within their own value systems and to learn by doing instead of learn by going to school or you know, have all of these different kind of opportunities. So I just think there's so many places that people can fit into this conversation, and it starts in the beginning, you know, with the First Nations and a municipality and their regional corporate titans getting together and really having honest dialogue about what are the barriers and what are some potential solutions.
I think that's a great challenge to issue to everyone watching today to start those conversations. I did want to build on what you said, Karen, and the question I asked for Carol Ann. And, you know, you hear a lot about, especially in sustainable economic development, you've heard the term for a number of years now about it having a triple bottom line. So you got your financial bottom line, you got a social bottom line, and you got an environmental. So do we look at a fourth bottom line, or is that the whole bottom line concept, we need to replace that with a whole different worldview? I'd be interested to hear your response to that and build on what Karen said.
I have a lot of thoughts about that. I think that in talking to my grandfather about this concept of Indigenomics, he says, "You're doing the big work, granddaughter." And I was like, okay, he asks me, he's a very traditional man, elderly, and he says, "What is Indigenomics?" And I said, Indigenomics is the spiritual reality behind how we experience economics right now. So we assume that there's three lines and we funnel and channel into these three lines, but reality, the same as what Karen said of a reflection of we are one, we have the same concept in Newtonal of everything is one and interrelated. And that's a much wholer perspective of economy, that way of life, ceremony, identity, values, and economic systems were built from. In going back to that concept of looking at this idea of systemic inclusion, if we can build upon this truth of a history built on economic exclusion, how that's still expressed today, and commit leadership to systemic Indigenous economic inclusion, that's really what Indigenomics is about. So at the Institute, I facilitate this concept of the Indigenomics economic mix, which is 12 levers to support the growth and design of the Indigenous economy. So those include areas such as equity ownership, capital, trade, procurement, entrepreneurship, technology, clean energy. When we look at these as hotspots of high levels of Indigenous economic activity, when we understand that this is a call to action of systemic Indigenous economic inclusion, locating your leadership is essential in this conversation. So where am I seeing leadership in this concept of Indigenomics and economic reconciliation? Across this country, I'm seeing this huge uptake of Indigenous Chamber of Commerce. that are included or related to regional chamber of commerce. So when we begin to see that construct of bringing visibility to Indigenous business, that's a place of leadership. When we begin to see Indigenous peoples on industry boards, that's a place of leadership and economic reconciliation. When we see banks and financial institutions supporting this concept of the capitalization of the Indigenous economy, that's locating your leadership in this conversation. I understand that through the island has this trade zone. So bringing Indigenous businesses into this concept. Where are your Indigenous businesses within the structure of this trade zone? This is the 2020 conversation of that, to begin to bring visibility to Indigenous business, where we're seeing regional districts all beginning to have Indigenous leadership and representation on these tables. So lastly, I would bring your attention to an earlier Indigenous Works report that went across the country, and whether it was large corporations or small, medium enterprises, where they asked the question of levels of engagement with Indigenous businesses. And shockingly, it was identified through these surveys that close to 85% of mainstream businesses in no way, shape, or form engage with Indigenous businesses. So I think this speaks to this pathway of locating leadership of the growth and design of the Indigenous economy. Thank you.
Thank you. I have another question, and then we're going to turn it over to our participants here. So a reminder, if you've got a question you would like to ask our panelists, please put it into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can this morning. So Karen, just building on that challenge, that there's still, there's some great examples you've pointed out. You alluded to a couple of examples of positive work, but what more do we need to be doing? What more does organizations like VIEA, which is committed to supporting First Nations businesses, as well as businesses and communities across this region, but we need to still be doing more. There's chambers of commerce, there's other organizations, both economic, educational, and government. So what more do we need to be doing to educate and to inform people of the tremendous opportunity, positive opportunity that we have, especially right now, as we collectively look at our economic resiliency after this very unique and challenging time that we're all living through? And how do we live that saying around that we're all one people? How do we move that forward?
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate the question. You're right. We have this amazing opportunity in the midst of this chaos and crisis to really redefine how we want to move forward with our economies and with our relationships as they exist in these geographically isolated areas, Vancouver Island being a beautiful example of it. And I think one of the first questions, there's two places I really want to go to. Number one is, what is the purpose of business? And because that fundamentally determines how Indigenous people are going to engage in this conversation. For lots of reasons, many Indigenous people, when you speak money or wealth, that's a dirty word. And so business, therefore, on top of that is even the worst, because that's like a practice of that, of accumulating that. And so we need to really redefine, look at people's experiences of money, remembering that from an Indigenous perspective, since money has come in as a commerce item within our cultures, we have been existing in a level of insufficiency. And so we view money from a level of deficiency as opposed to a level of self-sufficiency. So that's a really important question when we start thinking about how do we want to define wealth. And how we define wealth really is, what's the purpose of business? Is business there to make one or two people rich? Or is business there to help drive the well-being of a group of individuals that are co-located in a certain territory? I think that's a really important question for people to start having, because that's how you're going to get more and more Indigenous people meaningfully engaged in this conversation. The other thing that I think about, especially as we're talking about this time that we find ourselves in, I was down at a national conference in Quito, and I was struck by this group of 20 women, Indigenous women from all different places, and I had never seen this before in my life. And I've been traveling to a lot of different places, and they came in and they halted this whole conversation, the plenary. It was amazing and a little bit frightening, but but they talked about the concepts of time, and the kinds of leaderships that are required in different kinds of time. So typically, when we're existing in leadership or in a linear time zone, when things are stable, we have a clear direction, we have the momentum that we need to move forward. It's just a matter of moving forward slower or faster. That really is the leadership of, that's really a sort of a male-dominated leadership space. But when we're in a time of chaos, a time of circular time, where there's crisis, where there's opportunity, where our relationships to one another start becoming more and more important, that's an opportunity, that's a leading time of women as it relates to relationships. And so I think because we're in that time, we engage more in what are our relationships to one another? What is our responsibility to one another? How do we want to move forward together so that all of our children are able to achieve their optimum potential? And how are we going to do that in a way that's going to benefit everybody? And I think those are some great places for us to get into when we think about the purpose of business. Because when we define that, that's going to completely change the kinds of conversations that we have when we're at those tables that Carol Ann is referring to.
I'll put myself back on off mute. Well, thank you so much for that. At this time, we're going to move to our questions. We've got a great conversation going on here, and we will now go to our chat. Well, hello, everyone. So we have a lot of questions coming in here, and I don't think we're going to get to all of them today, but I will remind you that we do have a roundtable scheduled for 10 o'clock, and we'll get an opportunity to speak to both Carol Ann and to Karen about a lot of these things. So we'll try to get to as many as we can now. The first question we have here, what is the most exciting project, initiative, or partnership you've seen involving a First Nation community or business that you could share or describe? So Carol Ann or Karen, who would like to start with that? What is the most exciting project, initiative, or partnership you've been involved with involving a First Nation community or business that you could share or describe? Caroline, go ahead.
Sure, thank you. I am particularly excited about any of you are familiar on the west coast of Vancouver Island is the Ojibwe community. I'm particularly excited at looking at the evolution of their economy to look at inclusion of their economic presence in the forest industry, the fishing industry, the development of businesses, and an alignment of strategy that connects to the larger region. I think communities like this are driving small communities in terms of economic leadership and building what actual Indigenous economic presence looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.
I think there are a number of places where there's a lot of amazing things going on. I think, when we're talking about not just having people at the table, but sort of the kinds of opportunities that emerge from that. I'm thinking of Van City, for instance, who had all of their branches located in the Lower Mainland or in Victoria. And then, we had some conversations with them, and we were finally, them and village of Alert Bay and the Numgis First Nations, were able to have them come and move into and have their first branch located near or on a reserve in Vancouver Island. And so I think that those kinds of relationships are what's really important. And as a result of that, in order to keep that sustainable, because the co-op that was there, the bank that was there, left as a result of that, and it actually really undermined the whole business structure and financial institutions. But because they're a co-op with a larger vision and they're very strongly values led, they actually had people from the larger cities hold their resources within that branch so that that branch would have enough working capital to support what was going on there. Those are very, very practical things. For many people, it doesn't matter where you hold your resources when you're in a sort of an interest-bearing opportunity. And so holding it in a space like that actually made a huge difference in that community for them to be able to have long-term access to those kinds of resources.
So the next question actually relates to that. How can credit unions help Indigenomics? Caroline, do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. And I have huge appreciation for the structure and intention, the underlying objectives of credit unions. One example that I would use, I previously sat on the Victoria Community Microlending Board, and there was a company that had donated an initial startup Indigenous entrepreneurship microloan fund. And I think examples like that are places or spaces that credit unions can look at supporting the capitalization of the Indigenous economy. And a lot of times we see that these Indigenous businesses aren't wanting huge levels of early capital. Things under $10,000 is enough to support a small business going forward, but a lot of times are really not having that capacity or accessibility to a financial system. So I think a place where credit unions can look at is supporting Indigenous microloan funds. Examples like that through Victoria Microlending is an excellent example in a place that will have huge impact in supporting the capitalization of the Indigenous economy and the support structures of the growth of Indigenous businesses. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question. To what degree does access to post-secondary education in Canada contribute to the ability or inability of Indigenous young people to find a seat at the economic table? So what can post-secondary institutions do better to support long-term economic inclusivity? Karen, do you want to start with that one?
Oh, that's fun. I like that one. I think there's been a lot of work that people are beginning to get into. So, for instance, with SFU, they've began this MBA that has a focus on working within First Nations. I think those things are important. And there's also opportunities to move that so much further. And so if we're looking at an institution that trains people in the same way that everybody's been trained, then you're going to teach them to think the same way. And so they're going to make the same decisions. I think that there needs to be a space within institutions in particular that allows for differing ways of approaching economics and different ways of defining that. So I think, for instance, VIU, your work has a lot of parallels within trying to do some systems change around the economy. And I think that there's a greater opportunity, and I'm hoping that part of what we're doing here is to open up an educational system that shares the similar values of Indigenous people and respects the knowledge that comes from that. So for instance, rather than having an elder come in and you give them some kind of an honorarium, you actually put them into a faculty position that they're compensated in that way, and they're given access to the resources and the networks that they would need in order to actually impact a longer term change, and have those people be involved in how do you develop courses or teaching programs that are more reflective of the way Indigenous people live and learn?
Caroline.
Sure, thank you. I come from a Vancouver Island University background with this, both an undergrad and a master's level, and seeing the development of a partnership such as MasterCard Foundation that is supporting the doubling of Indigenous students within that university, I think is an admirable initiative that recognizes the role of education and post-secondary institutions in supporting both reconciliation and a allowable pathway for that increase of Indigenous students within that university. And I think examples like those types of partnerships really support post-secondary education accessibility at a young level while students are still in high school. There's a lot of room for institutional leadership of aligning pathways that support Indigenous student presence within the university, as well as aligning skill sets and success frameworks for students. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, can you speak about the challenges created by the Indian Act and relationships with financial institutions to business growth and access to capital?
I could take a stab at that.
We could be here all
Just a
day.
little question.
Go ahead, Caroline.
I just finished writing a book called Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table. And in that, there's an entire chapter of what I call Indian Act economics. So what it does is demonstrate the conditions of economic regression that have been established in the state relationship with Indigenous peoples since prior to the formation of Canada itself. So in the concept of Indian Act economics itself, what I establish is that Canada deserves better. And by Canada, I mean every single citizen that is on this call, as well as don't even know that they're negatively impacted by the Indian Act. What is important in this concept is that there's so many camps of, get rid of the Indian Act, or the Indian Act provides elements of protection for Indigenous people, of both which can be true in their own context. What is important to me is that this concept of Indigenomics supports the reduced impact of the parts of the Indian Act that demonstrate the conditions of economic regression. So there's a number of those in there which have not allowed nations the same fundamental or foundational elements to access to capital, money flow, system design, financial system design. And in that, what it is established again is that concept of the perfect conditions for economic regression. So the more that people are able to understand those conditions that have been established within the Indian Act, how that's expressed in policy and the regulatory environment, will also support a larger understanding of conflict within the economic development process, fundability of major projects, and a lot of the media narrative that we see in an ongoing media narrative daily within this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen.
I was having so much fun listening to Caroline on that one. Yeah, it's a huge question. I think that as we're going through all of this, there are so many places where the Indian Act interferes with and actively undermines economic self-sufficiency for Indigenous people. And I think that you'll find lots of references to that. So I actually wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the other side of that, which is the Tsilhqot'in case, where they were able to sort of create an opportunity for themselves to be able to be self-sufficient according to their own values and practices and traditions. And for them, that is a model of wealth. That allows them to be sustainable for future generations, and as well as have a portion or a toe or whatever you want to call it of their lands committed to more mainstream economic development opportunities. But their number one priority in that court case was actually to be able to maintain their territories and maintain their ability to do their fishing, to do their hunting. I mean, we're looking at the situation with the Mi'kmaq on the East Coast right now. And, you know, a lot of the comments that come in around that are, well, how many fish does one person need? And if you know anything about Indigenous fisheries, you know that, you know, one person is actually responsible for feeding probably 200 people within that community, and for a full year or until they get access to that fishery again. And so it's not about one person and one table. We only have so many boats within those communities, and so they're responsible for getting that and bringing that into the whole community. So there's lots of different ways that misinformation and misunderstanding actually can create some very dramatic situations that are portrayed, as Carol-Ann said, within the media, maybe not necessarily intentionally, but are portrayed in a way that makes it look like Indigenous people have some kind of control over all of this, when in fact they don't. They're actually, you know, if you're in a situation where you don't have access to capital, you don't have access to any of those resources, you need to be able to feed people within that community. And most of those rights and titles that people are referring to actually allow for that to happen. And so I think, you know, that's one place. This is like a huge question, great question.
Absolutely. Well, extremely timely as well at this point. So we have about 3 minutes left in this session, and we have way more questions than we could possibly, it would take me that long to read all the questions that we have here. So I want to remind everyone that we do have a roundtable organized at 10 o'clock. And I'm going to try to save these questions here and try to address as many of them as we can at 10 o'clock. I'm going to do one more here, and if we just keep your answers as short as possible, although it doesn't do justice necessarily to the question, we'll try to carry this on at 10 o'clock. So this question actually has to do with the concept of reconciliation, which we hear about a lot, and indeed that is partly the name of this session. So this is the question, is that actually the right term when we're talking about this concept? Is it actually more a question of decolonization first before even going to the word of reconciliation? So I guess the question is, what language would you prefer to see utilized moving forward so people of all nations can collaborate on their shared economic and sustainable future? Caroline, would you like to start?
I love that question. The first thought that came to my head was system and personal accountability. That's really what we're getting at, is being able to demonstrate specific outcomes. And I think that level of accountability, of deconstructing that, is decolonization. And the accountability for outcomes is and should be the foundation of reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen, you work for an organization that has that word in it.
Well, I think that, you know, reconciliation is a journey. It's a state of being, and it's a state of doing, as Carol-Ann stated. So I think just like anything, we have a society that espouses certain values of justice and equity or equality and inclusion and all of those kinds of things. And so how do we actually live up to that on a daily basis? How do we recognize some level of equity, especially in the economic spaces? And so for me, reconciliation really represents that, as Carol-Ann was saying, that end state. But there isn't an end state. It is a journey. And as we move forward, we're going to have different stages of it. So, you know, the first part is just showing up to something like this. I mean, 10 or 20 years, these weren't even available, these kinds of conversations, you know, and then maybe let's talk about decolonization. They're deep places, and maybe some people will never really get to that place in their journey of reconciliation. and they sort of act as allies in different ways, sort of living their life and putting in it. And maybe their children are impacted by that. And that's how it's passed down from generation to generation. But I do think that, you know, one of the places where we have a huge opportunity is in the kind of awareness that our young people have today about what are some of the situations that allow for this undermining. And I think that the responsibility for us as sort of the older generations is to really support them in that thinking and to provide them with some of our own history about what happened to us and what happened with our grandparents, and why do we behave the way that we behave today and do the things that we do, because it's both a thought and an act that we're needing to do. So I look at decolonization as the thought, and the act being reconciliation, very similar to Carol-Ann.
Well, that's a great place to leave this session on. There is so much more to talk about. We'll talk about that at 10 o'clock. And I don't think this will be the last conversation or indeed engagement we have on this very important file. So I want to thank Carol-Ann and Karen for being here. I want to thank all the people who attended today. And again, please join us at 10 o'clock. I have copied the questions that have come in so that we can address some of those. I want to also thank CPA BC for their sponsorship of this session. And I also want to say to both of our panelists that you will both be receiving a gift from St. Jean's Cannery Smokehouse, which is an Indigenous owned business of the Nuchalmut people. So a great way to end that, and a great way to thank you for your participation today. So Marcy Sepkasiam, thank you very much for joining us today.